I'm sorry, everyone, you get me again. And now explain what we've done in this group. So what we're dealing with is authentication, authorization, and accounting infrastructure. At the moment, we're concentrating on authentication and authorization because accounting tends to be local and tends to be based on local management structures. Our main objective is to make an implementation across the RIs within the ENVRI group with a technical implementation on the basis of the architecture definition, which I'll talk about in a minute, and having obtained that federated mechanism of access across all the RIs, include the central envri-hub within the scheme. The premise at the bottom is very important. We are not setting up an independent IDP, identity provider. We are using external IDPs, of which there are many, and we are assuming that there is management control and management approval of the IDPs that are being used. So here are the goals we set ourselves at the beginning of the work of this group, which again represents not only people from the IT partners in ENVRI, but also very heavily, in fact, people from the individual RIs. So goal 1 was to find a way to federate access. Goal 2 was to provide a method of authenticated users to access shared resources. That's authorization. Goal 3, the idea here is to overcome the heterogeneous landscape we have in terms of permissions. And we declared ourselves willing to try to find a minimal level of permissions to access across all the RIs for end users. Goal 4, once we've tested it within the cluster, we'll extend it to linking through to EOSC in both directions, an EOSC user being able to access information or assets in the RIs within ENVRI, and ENVRI users attached to the envri-hub being able to access the facilities and indeed the other services in the catalog of EOSC. Goal 5 was to promote the elaboration and adoption of authorization policies across the whole of ENVRI through all the individual RIs, but that requires a lot of negotiation with local management and local policies. So we're basing everything on BPA, the blueprint architecture, which comes from the AARC2 project, which is basically GÉANT, the linkage of the national research and education networks across Europe. The good thing about AARC2 is it specifies in great detail how you do authentication. That is, making sure a user is who they say they are. It gets a bit vague when it comes to authorization. There's a green box here, which basically says a store of local authorization policies. So they don't really help us too much with that. So what we have to do is move towards creating such a store. The results of our work have been a set of implications we have to consider. The first implication is we need a reference implementation that's robust and working, so other RIs, apart from the initial set working on this prototype implementation, can see how it works and understand it in more detail. The second implication is we need an underlying process and logic to manage authorizations. Implication 3, we need to converge to key technologies that are supported externally to ENVRI. We don't want to have the responsibility of doing that. And an example would be OAuth 2, and I'll talk about that just in a minute. Implication 4, notice this is a social one. We need tight communication channels among the RI security, AAI managers, and definition of procedures. This is very important to make sure that the security is appropriate. Implication 5, we need a contact list of the managers, obviously, in order to be able to get this working together. And there's a governance and legalistic implication that the different governance bodies in the RIs need to agree about what can be shared, and we need a governance framework based on policies. This may be set up or may be accelerated by policies coming from EOSC with which we have to align. And of course, we're all very concerned about the general data protection regulation and how this affects personal data. So authentication, that is ensuring we know that a user is who they say they are. We did a best practices overview of single sign-on federated identity and delegated identity. We defined the federation requirements. We looked at the protocols with the set of requirements top right. We wanted implemented solutions widely adopted and so on. And here's the table of the compatibility matrix. And what it tells you very clearly is using OpenID Connect for authentication and indeed OAuth 2 for authorization. So on authorization, different organizations have very different authorization schemas, and they're often very local to an RI. So we need a landscape analysis for doing that. And in fact, that's underway at the moment, and we're quite a long way down the track of getting that done. And we are bearing in mind all the time the EU recommendation, which is to be as open as possible and closed as necessary. The general situation we've been analyzing is using CRUDEL. There's the list of acronyms there. And as far as we can see at the moment, in general, but there are exceptions, in general, for users subject to licensing, then the access required is read, execute, and download. And system administrators need, obviously, full access. And we have a general agreement that we are moving towards OAuth 2 as the mechanism. So standing back a bit from the detail of the techniques and the technology for authentication and authorization, here is a kind of picture. So the red ellipse is the IT system. The top blue box is ENVRI overall policies, which splits into two parts. To the left, the RRI, responsible research and innovation policies, which are basically human-centric. And on the right, the asset policy, which is to do with the rights and restrictions associated with assets. So here we set up the, as it were, confrontation between the rights of people, users on the left, and the rights associated with assets on the right. On the left in the IT system, this condenses to user identity and API identity. On the right, the asset policy and restrictions links to curation, especially data management policies and data management plans, to cataloging and to provenance. And where the two come together in the middle is security, privacy, GDPR, and access control. And so that's where we resolve this confrontation. But it requires, as you see, these policies and development of these general policies is a long and quite a difficult business. So from policies, we have guidelines, and from guidelines, we have IT implementations. So our conclusions from the AAI team: we have a reference architecture. We need to consider the implications at the RI level in detail, and that's exactly what we're doing now with this actually second landscape exercise. We're converging towards using OpenID Connect for authentication and OAuth 2 for authorization. We have to discuss the implications for policies across ENVRI, the whole ENVRI, including all the RIs, to ensure that whatever policies are decided upon, the AAI, i.e. the IT technical implementation, is appropriate. We produced a white paper on this, which is available, and our output is that we believe we can actually manage to implement this, first of all, with a proof of concept, and then rolling it out widely to provide a secure policy-controlled system for managing access to assets. Thank you very much.